Is as a political philosopher, so you'll probably hear a lot about values and not much about facts. So in my 10 minutes, what I wanted to do was to draw attention to three, I think, important themes. One is just to explain or highlight ways in which climate change is an ethical issue. And I'm going to draw attention to 8 questions which we confront when we confront climate change, which are inherently ethical, and some of which Professor Edenhofer has already drawn attention to. Question 1 is, what is dangerous climate change? Dangerous is a value judgment. Is 1 degree increase dangerous? 1.5, 2? How can we define dangerous? What impacts constitute dangerous? Since we're faced with a problem characterized by considerable risk and uncertainty, what's the appropriate way, the just way to respond to things which are uncertain? What's the just distribution of the burdens of mitigation and adaptation? Should it be, for example, historical responsibility? Should it be according to ability to pay? Should it be on a more equal basis? Linked with this is what's a fair way of distributing emission rights? If, to draw on some kind of research, we have, let's say, 500 million tons of carbon to emit, how do we allocate that? How do we share that out? Equal per capita view, allocate it to those who have the greatest need because they have development rights, to those who already have, more should be given, or some other view. Picking up on a question that was, I think, raised in the last session, what's the relevance of the past and historic emissions, both to burden sharing and to emission rights? Is the past bygones, or do you inherit responsibilities because of past emissions of your fellow countrymen and women? What do we owe to the future, right? I mean, can we discount and have a positive pure time discount rate? Can we pass on the costs? Can we act now but defer the costs, which some people favour? And then if we confront climate policy, and again, just picking up on one of the questions, what are the moral constraints on climate policy? Sometimes people say, and I think very rashly, we should do whatever it takes. But I don't think they really mean that, because some mitigation policies will have very unsavoury implications. And others may have problematic ones. Issues to do with bioenergy, or nuclear, or hydroelectric, or hydraulic fracturing, or geoengineering, they all raise ethical issues, so they're kind of unavoidable. And then final ethical question, not that I think this is exhaustive, but I thought 8 was enough to keep you going. I'm afraid if you're political philosophy, you see ethical questions everywhere. But who has the right to make the decisions here? These are hard, complicated, controversial questions on which reasonable people disagree, but someone has to make decision. Well, on who, and who should be included? Who's entitled to be treated as a stakeholder, whether it's adaptation policy or geoengineering policy or mitigation policy? So given that I only have about 7 minutes left, I'm not going to answer those questions. But second theme then is, the fifth assessment report had one major innovation, well, it had more than one, but the one I wanted to focus on is directly related to what I just said, which is ethics is explicitly acknowledged as a very important consideration. And so Working Group 3 has this chapter, chapter 3, which has a major discussion of the ethical concepts. Of course, if you look at earlier reports, like, for example, a second assessment report does have discussions of equity. But this is done in a much more serious way with political and moral philosophers involved, like John Broome or Lucas Meyer. So, and partly, I think, due to Professor Edenhofer that we have this representation in there. So what did the ethicists do, or aim to do? There's 2 kinds of contribution there. And one is just to clarify notions of rights or justice or value, but also to comment a bit on some of the controversies surrounding these, because there isn't unanimity on these. So if you look at chapter 3, you'll find discussions of all of these topics, which track many of the things I mentioned earlier on. And you'll find some statements which represent a fairly consensus view, namely that duties to pay for some climate damages can be grounded in compensatory justice. There'll be disagreement about how much the past should matter there, because people will say if people are reasonably ignorant of the harmful effects of their activities, it's unfair to make them liable. But if people are aware or their ignorance is inexcusable, then they can be held liable. And one of the other kind of consensual findings was that principles of distributive justice can ground climate damages. So it's unfair to make people bear a burden if they don't have the ability to pay, and it's not unfair to make those with the greatest ability to pay to share more of the burden. How does this relate to the SPM? I mean, ethics did make it through to the SPM, and I mean, here I've put, I think, that the main statements that you find there. So it doesn't specify the substantive conclusions that I just referred to, but it acknowledges and makes very clear that the ethical issues are unavoidable. Whether we like it or not, we're confronted with something that has an ethical dimension, so we need to face up to that. So one thing I was asked to do there was not just to talk about the fifth assessment report and ethics and the findings there, but also to say something about the future and future directions. So let me turn now to that. Here are 4 things I think it's worth thinking about for future research. And I'm slightly worried that when I say this, someone says, but I do this already. Maybe you do, but I think there maybe could be more of it. So one is, and it's incredibly difficult, but I think there needs to be much more systematic integration of ethical principles into the analysis of mitigation. Often we have a very silo-based approach where ethicists will do their thing, and then people will work on transport policy or housing or some other mitigation policy or some alternative energy, and it's very hard to get those people to speak together, but I think it's very important to do that. If you did that, I think there'd be more focus on the distributive impacts of mitigation policies, and not just the aggregate costs, which are of course incredibly important, but how they fall in a distributive sense. And we might make more progress to having a framework for comparing options which are very different from one another. So how do you compare nuclear energy with biofuels, with hydroelectric energy, and the related merits and demerits? It's very hard unless you have something that draws, I think, ethical principles of fairness and rights with economic analysis. And this does happen, but I think there are disciplinary reasons why not more of it happens. So second thing I'd like to throw out there as directions for the future is often when I read discussions of energy justice, it's very much couched in terms of people's emission rights. People should have an equal per capita amount of emissions or some other metric of emissions. And the point I just want to say is a lot of ethicists would say it's wrong to focus on emissions. You should focus on the interests they serve. You should focus on human capabilities or people's access to food, health, water, and so on. And so framing it in terms of having a right to emissions misses the point. Emissions don't really matter. What really matter, of course the total amount matters, but for individuals what matters are those goods. So instead of assuming that you meet your distributive criteria by distributing emissions, I think it's better to have a more less fetishistic approach to those and more focused on the interests. Okay, 2 more points and then I finish. So one is this is probably an admonition to the ethicists, but it's very striking that the literature on ethics and climate change is dominated by people such as myself. And if it is a global problem, which it is, then it seems one lack is an analysis of non-Western ethical perspectives. Fourth one, and I guess this is the one I feel most strongly about, is that we know a lot about the economics of climate change policy and the science of it and some of the ethics of it. I think there needs to be much more focus on the political science of it. That is, how do you design institutions to make them less myopic, more collaborative? How do you design them to combine effectiveness with procedural justice? How do you incentivize long-term thinking, whether it's through legislative processes or courts or high commissioners? Because it's all very well having a very sensible climate policy, which is well costed, but if people don't have the institutional incentives to pursue it, then it won't happen. So I think more research needs to be done on that. And that's all for me. Thanks very much.